Hello, hello, dear students. So let me just set everything up. All right, so today we have a lecture number 3 in the course of Encounters with History from Webster University. So now we're going to talk about European missionaries and their experience in East Asia. The time that we're going to be talking about corresponds with the Latin American conquista. And some of the people that we're going to talk about here will be to some extent relevant, particularly the Portuguese. And we're going to talk about the early encounters of the Europeans with people in East Asia, with the empires of the old in the region. And those encounters will, and you will see why, play out a little differently compared to that of the encounters with Latin American civilizations. So let's start. Even though Western Hemisphere was the most inaccessible part of the world until 1492, for obvious reasons, we already discussed that, East Asia has remained just as isolated, even though people knew about it, and there have been systematic contact between the people of the so-called Europe, right, with the people of Asia, starting with ancient Greece, starting with ancient prehistoric Iran, starting with ancient Rome, right? So that was a known part of the world. The problem was it was so far away and there was no modern means of transportation that it was very hard for the people to get there, right? So it wasn't until late 1400s, early 1500s that the people were establishing proper routes to Asia. Again, one of the other factors that contributed, and as you remember, has contributed to finding new ways to achieve Asia, to arrive at Asia, would be the rising Ottoman Empire that controlled the shortest route and the safest route to Asia. So in 1497, Vasco da Gama, somebody you probably have heard of, has arrived to Asia looking for a new route to the east. Unlike the Americas, of course, where local states were in a state of disarray or some form of disbalance or deterioration, Asian countries at the time where the Europeans have arrived were in full power, comparable to the Europeans, which made trade more preferable than conquest, obviously, because A, these people, these travelers, the European travelers and traders were short-handed. They didn't have enough people, and the fact that the first ones to explore the systematic trade with Asia for early Renaissance Europe would be the Portuguese. Portugal is a very tiny country with very few people. So, of course, conquest was not by any means preferable to trade. Given how powerful empires like the Ming, China, or Mughal Empire in India were, European influence was very small compared to them. And often Europeans were okay with very unfavorable trade terms, not being seen as equals. And that desire to baptize everybody or desire to dictate their will, right, it somehow vanishes when you cannot do it for objective reasons, being not strong enough or not having enough people. Western influence in Asia first appeared with Portuguese sailors. I already mentioned that. They were the first ones to discover the most modern ships and means of transportation. They were dominating technologically when it came to naval power. They have taken a lot from the Arab sailors that have been doing that for years already. So they've taken that technology, they've adopted that technology, and have built one of the fastest and most technologically advanced ships of their own time. Um, and they had some great progress with taking control of ports in Macau, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Japan, and even India, right? So, before Goa was a European, fancy European resort, it was a trading base for the Portuguese. After their initial success, they started to spread their economic and political and even religious influence over Asian lands. They're quite active in that. This is the picture of Vasco da Gama. So but in about 30 years after that, after he arrived to Asia, unfortunately he died. The response of the people in East Asia was again to some extent unique compared to that of the Americas. We're going to discuss why. The kind of response to the European influence in the region depended greatly on political context of each countries, because all of these empires were different. They were set up different. There were cultural differences between them. There were specific historical environments where they have developed. So, of course, not all of them were very favorable. Some more favorable than others, of course. Japan at the time, for instance, was amidst an intense internal rivalry for power between local warlords, and its decentralized political system has both contributed to the active and sometimes quite aggressive interventions of the Portuguese. They saw the opening, they saw an opportunity, and they took it. While beneficial for the Portuguese in the very short term, this very aggressive and more aggressive towards the end approach has, in long-term perspective, led to a severe level of distrust to Europeans in Japan in general, to everything Western. It led to expulsion of Christians, the prohibition of Christianity, and then the country was isolated, went into the Sikoku, which is the isolation in Japan, in Japanese, for several hundred years, which was ironically the most stable period of existence of Japan. But regardless, yeah. So long story short, very very beneficial short term, not very beneficial long term. But today we know that there is a good percentage of Japanese people who are Christians, thanks to the very active Portuguese. But unlike Japan, China, for instance, was very centralized. And it has shaped the relations with the Western nations to be more focused on trade and economy and caused less suspicions in general. So they were a lot less political. There was not very much opportunity to even get political over there because it was a centralized country, right? Centralized state, centralized empire, with the entirety of the power in the hands of Chinese emperor and his ministers and his aides. As a result, China was quite actively trading through Macau, and a few privileged traders were even allowed to trade directly. As a result, lengthy coexistence of the elites alongside the Westerners has made them more susceptible to their ideas and cultures. So China never self-isolated from anything European, which again led to a very interesting consequence. While there are no Christians in China, really, not in great numbers, so the conversions were a failure. Economically speaking, it was a success because it led Western countries, when they rose in power, to take advantage of China and basically colonize it for a long period of time after the Opium Wars. So yes, this was not a nice consequence for the Chinese. This is the extent, just for you to understand, Europeans, or several hundred Europeans, come to Ming Dynasty China, and this huge piece of land, which is literally half of Europe, right? Size of half of the Europe, with millions of people. Great Wall is already there. There are two capitals, Beijing and Nanking, right? There's a bunch of trade centers, a lot of provincial capitals. It's very urban for the time, right? And all of them are concentrating on trade, right? They're very active traders. So in this sense, Europeans had, at this moment in time, right, they had no chance to actively do something in China, to colonize, conquer, or influence politically. No chance. With going to Japan, the situation is completely different. If China was a big chunk of land, here the map corresponds to 1564 and up to 1573. All of these little territories represent, just like in medieval vassal Europe, right? They represent a certain vassalage, right? A certain lord ruling all these territories. So all of these territories have their own lord, and those blue ones, right, are the smaller daimyo, right? Daimyo is the lord in Japanese, right? So they don't have like a distinction. It's not that hierarchical as in the European feudal hierarchy, right, where there's count, baron, and king, and etc., etc. So, and everything is very well structured. Here, if you're a daimyo, you're a daimyo. If you're a smaller daimyo, that means you have a smaller piece of land. You're not as rich, not as powerful. You don't have as many soldiers. So it's mostly, qualified by your military might and your and the money in your pocket. So, and some of those territories have been controlled by shogun, but shogun was basically just the top dog among his peers, right? It only meant that Everyone else is just looking how to backstab the shogun and take the shogunate for themselves. So yes, constant warfare between these various lords, between one another, with shogunate or the allies of shogunate or vice versa, the opponents of shogunate. So constant warfare, never-ending warfare. It wasn't just warfare between the lords. It was also the warfare between certain religious sects of the Buddhist, of various Buddhist temples that were fighting for people, right? Fighting for the people to, fighting for influence, right? Fighting for specific people that would go to their temple and give money to them, not to the other competing temple. So literally like the 1990s Russia bandits fighting for territory. Um, so hence, the never-ending violence at that moment in time. Culture and religious expansion in China. Let's focus a little bit on that. We mentioned this at some point. We have to uncover this, right? So there was a reason why China was such a great and lucrative partner for the trade. It was one of the best organized civil governance systems at the time, period, right? No system would be better or more sophisticated. For that period of time, that was the most sophisticated one. It was even severely surpassing Europeans and other Eastern nations around them. It wasn't the warlords or priests running the country. It wasn't conquest driven. It wasn't religion driven. It was a group of scholars and civil servants, bureaucrats that were running the country. This was the world's first ever system of civil service to the state. It was based on a culturally rich tradition of Confucianism, which was not as much a religion as a way of life, right? An instruction for good governance and creating a good state and how to be a good citizen, sort of deal. With elements of mysticism, but then again, so yeah, it still technically is a religion, but it is a very practical religion oriented at relationships and building proper relationships in the state, well-structured relationships. Given all that, locals had very little interest in Jesuit missions. Christianity and Western way of life was also very irrelevant to them, and in order to be more successful in their conversions, Jesuit order, the Portuguese, Jesuit order is the Portuguese, they had to adapt to the values of Confucianism and local culture context, making a peculiar hybrid of Christianity and a local culture. However, China was never a success in terms of religious culture conversion, quite vice versa. Some of the Jesuits have converted to Confucianism, and like Matteo Ricci, one of the most successful one of them, right, one of the most influential ones in China, he actually left Jesuit order. He stayed and served as an aide to the emperor, which was an unseen privilege before, and he died, in privilege with a lot of money and well-respected individual. So this is the Jesuit order. How you can see, I know some of you guys are Muslims, some of you are not religious, and almost none of you are Christians, and of course, almost none of you, I almost guarantee, are Catholic. But you are aware that this is properly not how a Catholic priest normally looks like. This is because this is a traditional Confucian dresses that they're wearing. And this is their adaptation. They try to adapt to the local culture. And the reason for that was very simple. Confucianism, if you wanted to, like China typically, especially Ming China, the consequent dynasties, they've been favoring Confucianism as a state religion. They haven't been intolerant to other religions, so they've been Muslims at some point, they've been Buddhists, of course, but neither Muslims or Buddhists were able to properly fit into the system, so they would never serve as civil servants, would never serve in the bureaucratic system, would never serve the government, right? For that, you needed to be Confucian, and Europeans originally came around and appealed to Buddhist traditions and were very surprised to see that nobody was reacting to them properly. Nobody was talking to them seriously, right? Nobody was having any serious talks with them, and nothing was being done. Basically, nobody prosecuted them, but also it didn't really favor their stay in China. So they then learned that China is not Buddhist. There are Buddhists, but it's not Buddhist per se. Most of the people are Confucian, right? And this is when they started to appeal to that Confucian tradition, study that Confucian philosophy, and again, some of them believed it to be so progressive, so great that some of them have become agents of Chinese influence rather than vice versa. So let's go forward. And again, the Jesuit order is typically a little more flexible in terms of mixing Catholic religion with other cultural, forms of other cultures. And for that, they were very much criticized by, let's say, Franciscans for the Spanish, right, who were more uptight, very strict about following the religious norms, and have complained on various accounts to the Pope on what have the Jesuits been doing. Claiming this is not real Christianity, right? The results of Jesuit tactics in China were quite interesting. For one, once again, integrating Christianity with the traditional Confucian norms through integration did not allow Christianity to overshadow the original religion. Nobody was really interested in that. Nobody saw any opportunities in becoming Christian. Quite on the contrary, instead of lobbying the interests of European nations, once again, they became the lobbyists of the Chinese interest to some extent. And one of the, again, reasons, most important reasons that Christianity could not compete with Confucianism in China is that Confucianism is more a way of life, not just a religion. It's a little more, 360 degrees. It's just a philosophy that tells you how to be a good citizen, a good father or husband or wife or daughter or son, etc., etc. It's about the relationships, and it's not about that mystical belief in God, heaven and hell. This is how the Wan Li Emperor looked like in the state ceremonial dress court. So you can definitely see from this attire that he's wearing that this is it's not a warrior, it's not a priest, it's not religious. It is a civil servant, really, right? So you can see like a civil ruler on the picture. And if we go to Japanese ruler, with titled shogun, right, we would see a completely different story. We're going to see that in a second. So what about Japan? Cultural and religious expansion in Japan happened differently once again because of the feudal division of Japan. All these lords competing with one another and shogun competing with those lords and trying to ensure status quo. They've seen Europeans as an opportunity because they've been bringing knowledge, they've been bringing technology, they've been bringing nice goods, weapons, firearms, everything that they could have used, and of course money. So all of that has been looking very, very convenient for the local lords who thought that I'm going to have great relationship with the Europeans and that's going to help me compete with my opponents, right? And the shogun himself believed that the Europeans are going to give him an upper hand and helping control those rebellious daimyos. Um, Utilizing the decentralization, they managed to get more people of power converted, especially through the idea that there's a specific hierarchy there, right? There is the cult of loyalty, and there is a cult of obeying your master. That means that if you convert the lords, and this is what they've been doing, they've been converting peasants, right? They've been converting the lords, because if the lords converted, all his samurai, which is an alternative to a medieval European knight, right? All his samurai will convert into Christianity as well. That means all the people under them would also feel compelled to convert to Christianity. This is how Christianity spread so fast in Japan. And of course, it was also culturally appealing, right? Because it was a society based on loyalty for a daimyo, lord, and shogun, right? And it was seen a norm that Christianity was also that religion that favored loyalty to one lord in heaven, right? So it was like a continuation of hierarchy, which was very, easy to understand for the Japanese people. The relations between the shogun and the Christian missionaries were quite warm until 1591, when the shogun felt that rising influence of the Christians is becoming a threat to his rule. So Toyotomi Hideyoshi, is the shogun that we're discussing, right? Who's seen Europeans come, who's been having them for a long period of time, but who was also one of the first shoguns to start expelling, executing Europeans. So as you can see, compared to the civil servant of an emperor in China, we see clearly that shogun is a military leader, a war leader, right? He's literally a general of generals, right? He's not an emperor, he's not a king, he's literally a general of generals, which creates a certain environment, right? It is a certain environment where, again, who's to say that some other general cannot take this place, right? So yeah, shogunate was always, any shogun would always be the one to have a target on his back. By 1590s, another Catholic order appeared. The Franciscans, I already mentioned them. Most of them are from Spain. They came to Japan and criticized Jesuit's subtle approach and adaptation to local culture. They said they said to the church, to the Pope, that this is not okay, right? We have to be a little more bold and aggressive because we are the carriers of the true religion, right? And this has caused a lot more distrust between the Christians and the shogun. Finally, in 1596, because of the Spanish, their ship has been sailing to the Pacific Ocean, and their ship crashed. It was destined to Mexico. It was carrying soldiers, weapons, and everybody who survived were executed because the shogun found that the ship was full of munitions and soldiers and thought that those soldiers were supposed to overthrow the regime in Japan and conquer and start a civil war. So he executed everybody. He's also executed all the Franciscans in the capital as well. As a result of that, after that, only the Jesuits, few Jesuits were allowed to remain. Not all of them, but very few of them were allowed to remain to manage the trade, right? That was the only reason. There were shorter numbers. They've been trying to negotiate their return, but no luck. And he died. His successors by 1620s promoted, kept promoting the idea of isolating from the Europeans. And by 1620s, most influential Jesuits had to leave the country regardless, and Christianity was banned. Christianity was banned, and the people were, those who have converted to Christianity have been given a choice. Either you convert back to Shintoism, traditional Japanese religion, or Buddhism, also traditional to historically okay and traditional for Japan, or you die. And a lot of people were executed, but a lot of people went into hiding. And while technically being Shinto, they were Christians, but hidden Christians, which is Kakuro Christians in Japanese. You're gonna watch a movie about this, and those who are attentive enough would pay attention because some of those materials can appear in the midterm test. So conclusion is very simple. The Jesuit encounter with the Japanese ended quite differently than the one from China, and the consequences of that are uncanny because while Japan would seem like a wild success at the beginning, uh, further on, it has led to prohibition of Christianity, although temporarily, for a long period of time, but still temporarily, right? And still a lot of Christians exist up until today. Some of them have converted to proper Catholicism. Other ones keep continuing cherishing their religion and worshiping it the way it was in 1600s, the way they received it in 1600s, in the early 1600s. So China never was a success in terms of conversion, but economically and politically speaking, it was a larger success because it kept providing more trade benefits, and despite the fact that the Portuguese lost access to China quite soon, the Europeans in general would still continue to be very closely tied with China right until the moment of proper colonization under the Opium Wars, when the Europeans would gain so much power and China would decline relatively compared to the Europeans that it will be an easy grab for the British. So that would be spread between all the European countries like a pie. So um, and there was a lot of cultural exchange. There was a lot of technological exchange, and the Jesuits, unlike simple sailors, unlike traders who quite oftenly were might have been seen as unclean or unworthy of talking to and not important. The Jesuits were seen as an elite of the European society because they've been hoarding all that knowledge throughout the medieval times, right? So still, churches and monastical orders have been those who are concentrating knowledge and education in their hands. So, of course, they've been looking at them as the providers of knowledge, as the source of knowledge. Of course, these people have been privileged and have been accepted with interest rather than aggression or distrust. And only the actions of the Europeans in some cases have caused that suspicion and distrust in the case of Japan. Um, Next slide. Yeah. What we also need to mention to outline is that relations between Westerners and these two nations continue to be strained into the modern period, right? Japan, as already said, isolated itself in 1640, thereby only allowing one Dutch ship a year. So, well, Dutch have been replacing the Portuguese influence because the Dutch, for a variety of reasons, have been more successful and, like, have been taking Portuguese experiences and perfecting them. So the Dutch have technically taken Japan, but only with one ship a year. So technically, there's not that much trade happening. It's mostly for reputational purposes. Hey, we also have Japan. That's a part of our colonial trading empire, sort of deal. So only one ship a year, and they've secluded it specifically to the Deshima Island. Deshima Island is at the Bay of Nagasaki, and it is an artificial island they built specifically so the Europeans would never see the normal Japanese people, would never be able to learn Japanese, would never be able to know anything about Japan. Only the trusted people that Shogun trusted were able to go there, the officials and the military, and manage the trade with the Westerners. Westerners, even if they landed through the shipwreck or any other unintentional, way they landed on Japan, were liable to execution. That rarely happened. More often than not, you just send them away. But that's it, right? It could be punishable by death. Isolation lasted for a little bit more than 200 years. And it was one of the most stable periods of Japanese existence in its history. However, they were dragging in development. They were lacking in development. And American Commodore Perry in 1853 wanted to trade with them. They declined, and he opened up Japan by force. With very few forces, with very few power, he managed to put the country on its knees. So the country realized, Japan realized it is being dragged behind, and it became weak because of the isolation. So, and a whole other consequence of events has been set off by this. Um, So China continued to trade with the West on favorable terms until the introduction of the British East India Company and its opium in the 1790s. And the British were trading with opium was a great success. They attempted to open up China to trade through the diplomatic mission of Lord George Macartney in 1793. It was a failure because he met an emperor, requested to trade he requested more trade ports and better access, fewer restrictions on trade, but the emperor refused and condescendingly stated that China had no need for Western trade goods. And it was already becoming clear in China that there's an epidemic of opium consumption, and they didn't want that opium in their country. However, the British, having failed with the negotiations, began to illegally import opium. And that is something that led to the confrontation leading to the Opium Wars. In 1842, after a series of British incursions, the Chinese were forced to sign unequal treaties and basically de facto became subject to European Western colonial domination that lasted up until World War II. So this is the reading, guys, that you should do to prepare for the questions, right? 35, 55. Only 20 pages, very easy. These are the questions that we're going to discuss when we meet in person, well, online, screen to screen. And finally, the 3 videos would be great for you to watch all of them, especially the first one about the hidden religion banned in Japan for 200 years, right? That one is especially important. Some of those materials can be in the midterm, but the other 2 can also be included depending on my mood. So these 3 videos are greatly educational, but I would specifically outline, if you are unable to watch the rest, at least watch this one, right? The first one. So on this note, I hope that everybody understands the importance of these videos, that everybody understands the importance of reading in preparation for the class, because we're not spending all that much time together. It becomes more and more reliant on your self-education because of the format. So yes, please don't ignore the videos. Please don't ignore the readings. Don't just rely on ChatGPT to participate in the discussions, okay? It will be a horrible thing to do, absolutely pointless, and ChatGPT is not going to help you when you are going to be doing the test, right? So, long story short, thank you very much, and I'll see you when I see you. Probably next week, maybe earlier. So, good luck and bye.